In the spring of 2025, millions of people online became convinced that FBI agents had pulled back a hidden panel in Gene Hackman's mansion and found a secret underground tunnel packed with hundreds of bodies. It sounds like the plot of one of his own thriller movies, except this time the internet insisted it was real. So what actually happened inside that house in Santa Fe, and how did a story this dark, this specific, and this widely believed turn out to be something almost entirely different from what everyone thought? Gene Hackman was one of the most respected actors of his generation, a two-time Oscar winner known for roles in films like The French Connection and Unforgiven, who quietly stepped away from Hollywood in the early 2000s and settled into a private life in New Mexico with his wife, Betsy Arakawa, a classical pianist. For roughly 2 decades, he mostly stayed out of the public eye, which is exactly the kind of long, quiet silence that tends to make people curious the moment something finally breaks it. Before diving deeper into how this rumor spread, it helps to understand exactly why Gene Hackman was the kind of name capable of generating this level of viral attention in the first place. Over a career spanning more than 4 decades, Hackman built a reputation as one of the most consistently powerful actors of his era. Someone directors trusted to carry morally complicated, intense roles without ever tipping into cartoonish villainy or hollow heroism. He won his first Academy Award for playing a relentless, morally gray detective in Hoyt, The French Connection, and his second for playing a corrupt sheriff in Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, a performance widely regarded as one of the finest supporting roles in modern film history. He also appeared in blockbuster franchises, played memorable villains, and worked with some of the most respected directors of his generation, building the kind of career longevity that very few In late February of 2025, that silence broke in the worst possible way. Maintenance workers arrived at the couple's home in Santa Fe and discovered both Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa dead inside, along with one of their dogs. The circumstances were immediately unusual enough to attract intense media attention, not because anything sinister had happened, but simply because 2 people had died in the same home without anyone realizing it for what appeared to be several days. That kind of gap, where public figures go silent and nobody notices right away, is exactly the sort of detail that tends to generate speculation long before official investigators have a chance to release real answers. And in the earliest hours after the news broke, that's precisely what started happening across social media. While the tunnel rumor was busy spreading across social media, something far less dramatic, but arguably more consequential, was actually happening in the background. Hackman's estate, represented by an attorney named Kurt Summer, was actively working through legal channels to block the release of certain photographs and footage connected to the death investigation. This wasn't some shadowy cover-up effort. It was a fairly standard legal move by a grieving estate trying to protect the family's privacy and preserve Hackman's public legacy, arguing that once sensitive images became public, there would be no way to ever fully undo that exposure. That legitimate, well-documented legal effort to protect privacy is worth mentioning specifically because conspiracy-minded corners of the internet sometimes latched onto it as supposed evidence that something was being hidden. In reality, it was simply a family exercising a completely ordinary legal right, filing paperwork through the state and county offices exactly the way any grieving family with means and legal representation might do after losing loved ones under public scrutiny. The existence of a real legal filing about privacy became, for some corners of the internet, just enough ambiguity to graft an entirely unrelated and fabricated tunnel story onto. It took roughly 2 weeks for New Mexico's chief medical examiner to hold a formal news conference and lay out what investigators had actually determined. According to that official statement, Betsy Arakawa had died around February 11th from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare but serious illness caused by exposure to rodent droppings, something not uncommon in parts of the rural American Southwest. Gene Hackman, who was 95 years old and living with advanced Alzheimer's disease at the time, died roughly a week later from severe heart disease, with his Alzheimer's listed as a significant contributing factor. The medical examiner even noted it was quite possible Hackman wasn't fully aware his wife had passed away, given the state of his health, which is an almost unbearably sad detail on its own without needing any embellishment whatsoever. That is the real, documented, medically confirmed account of what happened. 2 elderly, ailing people, living quietly and privately, passed away under tragic but ultimately explainable circumstances just days apart. But 2 weeks is a long time for the internet to wait for answers. And in that gap between the initial news breaking and the official medical findings being released, a completely different story started to take shape. It didn't come from investigators, journalists, or anyone with actual access to the case. It came from a YouTube channel called The Ultimate Discovery, a channel that specializes in exactly the kind of sensationalized, mystery-driven content its name suggests. The video claimed that FBI agents had raided Hackman's mansion and discovered a hidden passageway concealed behind a library wall, leading down into what the video described as a vast, eerie underground warehouse. According to the video, this hidden space was filled with old documents, antiques, unidentifiable machine parts, and walls covered in strange runes and symbols that supposedly couldn't be translated. And then it escalated even further, claiming this underground chamber connected to a larger network of tunnels, compared directly in the video to the catacombs beneath Paris, and that inside this network, investigators had allegedly found the remains of 701 bodies. Read that back for a second, because the specificity is actually the whole trick. 701 is an oddly precise number. It's not hundreds or a large number, it's a hyper-specific figure that sounds like it came from an actual forensic report, even though no such report exists anywhere. That kind of manufactured precision is one of the most effective tools in viral misinformation, because vague claims tend to trigger skepticism, while specific, detailed claims tend to bypass it. Our brains are wired to associate specificity with credibility, even when that specificity is completely invented. The video also folded in real, verifiable details, like the actual timeline of when Hackman and Arakawa's bodies were discovered, blending true information with fabricated claims so smoothly that casual viewers had no easy way to separate fact from fiction without doing outside research themselves. The video spread fast, eventually racking up more than 800,000 views, and it didn't stay contained to YouTube for long. Clips and screenshots of the claims started circulating on TikTok, X, and Threads within days, often stripped of any context about where the story originally came from. By the time it reached a typical social media user's feed, it frequently arrived as a screenshot or a short clip with no visible source at all, just a shocking claim about a legendary actor, a secret tunnel, and hundreds of bodies, presented with the same tone and urgency as breaking news. Comment sections filled up with people treating the claim as established fact, building further theories on top of it, speculating about cults, secret societies, and cover-ups, each new layer adding more dramatic detail while moving further and further away from anything resembling actual evidence. This kind of thing is far from unique to Hackman's case, and looking at the broader pattern actually makes the mechanics much easier to spot next time. Nearly every major celebrity death in the social media era has generated at least one wildly exaggerated conspiracy claim within days of the news breaking, ranging from secret causes of death to hidden foul play to elaborate cover-up. Narratives involving powerful, unnamed figures. Most of these claims share a nearly identical structural DNA. They emerge fastest during the earliest information vacuum, before official reports are released. They borrow real, verifiable details to build credibility. They lean on emotionally charged language and vivid, almost cinematic imagery, things like hidden passageways, secret warehouses, or ancient symbols, because vague claims simply don't spread as effectively as vivid ones. And they almost always originate from channels or accounts explicitly built around sensationalized, entertainment-first content, even when that framing gets stripped away by the time the claim reaches a casual scroller's feed. Recognizing that pattern doesn't require any special expertise or insider knowledge, it just requires knowing what to look for, which is honestly half the reason stories like this one are worth unpacking in detail rather than simply dismissing as internet noise. Here's the part of this story that deserves genuine attention, because it's honestly more interesting than the fake tunnel itself. The channel behind the original video didn't even try particularly hard to hide what it was doing. Buried in the video's own description was a disclaimer stating that its content was intended solely for entertainment purposes, that it draws upon a mix of facts, rumors, and fiction, and that viewers shouldn't interpret any part of it as factual or definitive information. In other words, the creator built a viral conspiracy theory, attached a legal disclaimer admitting it wasn't necessarily true, and then relied on the fact that almost nobody scrolls down to read video descriptions before hitting share. That single detail tells you almost everything you need to know about how a huge amount of viral misinformation actually gets produced today. It's not always malicious hackers or foreign disinformation campaigns. Sometimes it's simply engagement-optimized entertainment content wearing the costume of investigative journalism, spreading not because anyone set out to deceive millions of people, but because shocking claims travel faster than boring, accurate ones. Once the claim reached a large enough audience, professional fact-checkers stepped in to actually investigate it properly, the way the original video never bothered to. Snopes, one of the most established fact-checking organizations online, examined the tunnel, claimed directly and found absolutely nothing to support it. No law enforcement agency had reported any investigation into Hackman's property involving tunnels or concealed structures of any kind. No credible news outlet, and by that point, dozens of major outlets were covering the Hackman story closely given his fame, had reported anything remotely resembling this claim. Snopes also caught a smaller but telling factual error buried inside this video, which claimed Hackman and Arakawa's deaths were announced on February 26th, when in reality their bodies were discovered that day, but the news wasn't made public until the following day. Small inconsistencies like that are often the easiest thread to pull on when trying to determine whether a viral claim is genuinely investigative or simply fabricated for views. So why did so many people believe it anyway, even after fact-checkers debunked it directly? Part of the answer has nothing to do with Gene Hackman specifically, and everything to do with how deeply tunnels and hidden underground spaces are wired into human storytelling. Throughout history, people really have used underground spaces for secrecy. Cave paintings tens of thousands of years old suggest early humans treated caverns as sacred hidden sites. Ancient followers of certain Roman-era religious cults dug private tunnels specifically to perform rituals, shielded from public view, swearing oaths never to reveal what happened underground. Paris really does sit on top of roughly 170 miles of tunnels filled with human remains, a genuine historical fact that most people are only vaguely aware of. Even now, most major cities are built on top of extensive networks of utility tunnels, transit systems, and maintenance passages that ordinary people never see or think about. In other words, the idea that something strange might exist beneath our feet isn't pure fantasy. It's rooted in enough real history that a fabricated tunnel story doesn't sound entirely implausible on its face, which makes it dramatically easier to believe than a conspiracy theory built on something with zero basis in reality whatsoever. There's also the layer of celebrity mystique working in the background here. Hackman had lived out of the public spotlight for roughly 2 decades before his death, and that kind of prolonged, voluntary disappearance from public life tends to generate its own gravitational pull toward speculation. When a famous person goes quiet for that long, some part of the audience assumes there must be a hidden reason behind it, even when the much simpler explanation is that a wealthy, private, aging man in poor health genuinely just wanted to live out his final years away from cameras. Add in the genuinely strange and tragic real circumstances of his actual death, 2 people passing away days apart inside the same home without anyone noticing, and you have exactly the kind of emotionally charged, slightly eerie real story that primes an audience to accept an even stranger, fictional one layered right on top of it. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who actually likes seeing how viral stories like this get built and unraveled, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't, because we cover stories exactly like this one all the time. What makes this particular case such a useful example isn't really about Gene Hackman at all, honestly. It's about the pattern itself, because this exact formula shows up again and again around almost any public figure's death. Start with a real, well-documented tragedy that already has an emotional pull on the public. Introduce a vague but ominous claim, usually involving something visually evocative, like a hidden tunnel, a secret room, or a locked vault. Add oddly specific numbers or details that feel like they must have come from somewhere official, even though they didn't. Wrap the whole thing in the language of investigative reporting, terms like FBI raid, classified documents, and forensic evidence, without ever actually citing a single verifiable source. And then let social media's sharing mechanics do the rest of the work, because outrage, mystery, and shock consistently outperform calm, accurate reporting when it comes to how far and how fast content actually spreads. It's worth noting that even after Snopes and multiple other fact-checking outlets thoroughly debunked the tunnel claim, follow-up versions of the story kept mutating and resurfacing months later, sometimes stripped of the original YouTube channel's name entirely, sometimes reframed with slightly different details to feel fresh again. Some later versions dropped the specific body count but kept the tunnel itself, describing a reinforced underground structure supposedly discovered during a land inspection near Hackman's property, complete with claims that investigators had begun documenting the site before records mysteriously disappeared and sources reportedly went quiet. That's a genuinely fascinating detail. About how misinformation evolves over time. Once a claim gets thoroughly debunked in its original form, it doesn't necessarily disappear. It often just gets remixed into a new version, sometimes deliberately, sometimes simply through the natural game of telephone that happens as a story gets retold, screenshotted, and reshared across different platforms and different audiences who never saw the original debunking in the first place. This is also a good moment to point out how genuinely hard it can be for an average viewer to catch these things in real time, even a careful one. The original video wasn't crudely made. It used dramatic narration, real photographs of Hackman's actual home pulled from legitimate news coverage, and it wove and confirmed facts about the timeline of his death alongside the fabricated tunnel. Claims. Mixing verified information with invented details is a far more effective technique than simply making something up from scratch, because it gives the false claims a kind of borrowed credibility from the true ones sitting right next to them. If you already know that Hackman really did die around that specific time, and the video gets that detail correct, it becomes psychologically easier to extend a little bit of trust to the next claim in the same video, even if that next claim has absolutely nothing behind it. It's also worth sitting for a moment on what actually got lost in all of this, because that's the part that rarely makes it into the viral version of the story. Betsy Arakawa was a concert pianist in her own right before shifting her career and devoting decades of her life to Hackman, and by most accounts, theirs was a genuinely close, private partnership built far away from the spotlight either of them could have easily chased if they'd wanted to. The real story of their final days together, an elderly husband with advanced Alzheimer's possibly unaware that his wife of decades had already passed, is heartbreaking enough entirely on its own merits. It doesn't need a secret tunnel, a body count, or cover-up narrative bolted onto it to be worth talking about or worth remembering. If anything, burying that real, quietly tragic human story underneath a mountain of fabricated conspiracy content does a disservice to both of them, replacing an honest, sad ending with a cartoonish, sensationalized one built purely for clicks. So where does that leave the real story, the one that actually happened, without any invented tunnels or hidden chambers attached to it? Gene Hackman, one of the most decorated actors of his generation, spent his final years living quietly with his wife in New Mexico, largely withdrawn from the industry that made him famous. He died from heart disease, compounded by advanced Alzheimer's, just days after his wife passed away from a rare illness linked to rodent exposure in what medical examiners determined was a tragic but medically straightforward set of circumstances. There was no FBI raid, no hidden passageway behind a library wall, and no underground network of tunnels filled with unidentified remains. What there was, instead, was an entertainment channel that recognized a grieving public's hunger for answers, arriving faster than officials could provide them, and filled that gap with a story dramatic enough to generate 800,000 views before anyone bothered to check whether a single piece of it was true. That gap, the space between a tragedy happening and verified facts becoming available, is exactly where stories like this one are born, almost every single time. It happened with Hackman, and it has happened with countless public figures before him, and it will almost certainly happen again the next time a beloved private celebrity passes away under circumstances that take investigators more than a day or two to fully explain. The lesson sitting underneath this entire story isn't really about tunnels or bodies, or even about Gene Hackman specifically. It's about recognizing the shape of how misinformation gets built in real time, piece by piece, using real tragedy as its foundation and manufactured specificity as its scaffolding, long before the actual facts ever get a chance to catch up and set the record straight. The next time a wildly specific, dramatic claim about a public figure crosses your feed, especially one that arrives suspiciously fast, wrapped in official-sounding language but without a single, verifiable source attached to it, it's worth pausing for just a moment before hitting share. Ask where the claim actually originated, whether any credible outlet has independently confirmed it, and whether the number attached to it feels oddly specific, in a way that real, still-developing investigations almost never are this early. That one small habit of pausing before sharing is really the only defense that has ever consistently worked against this kind of viral misinformation, and it costs nothing more than a few extra seconds of curiosity before you pass a story along to everyone else in your feed. It's a small habit, but at scale, across millions of people making that same small choice, it's genuinely the difference between a false story dying quietly and one exploding into 800,000 views before anyone bothers to check if a single word of it holds up.